March 9, 1945. Another kind of storm, one unleashed not by nature but by the relentless machinery of war, was brewing as the sun set over the Mariana Islands. Loaded with bombs and a terrifying new weapon designed for a single destructive purpose, 325 B-29 Superfortresses stood ready. What followed was not just another bombing raid. That night would go down in history as a conflagration that Tokyo and the rest of the world would never forget. But why did America resort to such harsh methods, and was there really anything that could have prepared Japan for the impending fire? The airfields of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian were bustling with activity. These islands, which had been hard-won under Japanese rule, now served as launch pads to attack the center of the enemy empire. The huge silver bombers, the B-29 Superfortress, were surrounded by a crowd of ground crew. This machine, which cost more to manufacture than the atomic bomb itself, represented the supremacy of the American Air Force. Each aircraft, powered by 4 colossal Wright engines and measuring almost 30 meters in length with a wingspan of 43 meters, was a monument to American industrial superiority. They were more than just aircraft. They represented a nation that was fully prepared for war. However, Major General Curtis LeMay's order for this operation was unique. It was a risk, a drastic departure from the high-altitude precision bombing that had been so ineffective against Japan until then. The bombs were scattered by the jet stream, the strong winds high above the ground, and the targets were often completely obscured by hanging clouds. LeMay, known for his direct assessment of reality, knew that something had to change. He had a bold, reckless, and well-thought-out solution: ignore accuracy from 30,000 feet. They would fly low that night, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, well below the unpredictable jet stream and below the effective ceiling of most powerful Japanese anti-aircraft guns. To achieve this, LeMay ordered the B-29s to be stripped of most of their defensive machine guns and ammunition so they could carry the largest possible payload. Lighter aircraft consumed less fuel and, more importantly, had more space for payload. This was almost twice as large, but not in terms of explosives. That evening, fire was the weapon of choice. Thousands upon thousands of M69 incendiary bombs were packed into the bomb bays. 1,120 separate 6-pound steel tubes were distributed in clusters carried by each bomber and designed to disintegrate in the air. Napalm, a gel-like gasoline compound that burns fiercely at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, sticks to everything it touches, and is water-resistant, was contained in each tube. They would disperse their deadly cargo horizontally into houses and workshops after piercing thin roofs and be guaranteed to ignite by a delayed fuse. The goal was to set an entire city on fire, not just destroy buildings. The target was Tokyo's densely populated 12-square-mile Shitamachi district, home to 750,000 people and consisting mainly of wooden houses and small craft workshops. American intelligence knew that these were more than just residential buildings. They housed countless small workshops that manufactured precision tools, electronics, and aircraft components, all important components of the Japanese war machine. The key to crippling Japan lay in destroying this network. The density of the wooden buildings and the strong winds forecast for that night could, according to planners relying on Japanese maps and pre-war data, produce something truly terrifying. A firestorm, a self-sustaining conflagration that would generate its own hurricane-force winds and engulf everything in its path. It was a frighteningly scientific method of destroying cities. The first B-29s flew in independent formations, following radio signals to a single point on the map as they thundered down the runways and climbed into the darkening skies over the Pacific. The Pathfinders flew ahead and were tasked with marking the target area with a giant mile-long burning X. The selected region would become a sea of flames when the main force followed. The atmosphere was uncomfortable for the crews, some of whom had questioned LeMay's dangerous tactic of flying low. They were aware of both the strategic importance and the potential danger. They trusted LeMay's ice-cold logic and the overwhelming strength of their machines. In Tokyo, however, life continued in a somewhat complacent manner despite the shadow of war. Previous high-altitude B-29 attacks had undoubtedly been terrifying, but the damage had often been scattered, and the sirens were more of a nuisance than a real threat to most people. Yes, air raid drills were conducted, but the city's defenses were sadly unable to withstand the scale of the attack that was brewing over the sea miles away. The vast city was guarded by fewer than 500 anti-aircraft guns, many of which lacked effective radar for night targeting. Fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, and the lack of airborne radar, essential for detecting bombers in the dark, hampered the Japanese night fighter force. Pilots often used searchlights, which they simply pointed in the right direction, an almost impossible task given the speed of the B-29s. The contrast between a defense network struggling with outdated technology and scarce resources, and hundreds of the world's most advanced bombers, could not have been greater. At around 10:30 p.m., sirens sounded throughout Tokyo. Many locals probably remained where they were at first, as they were accustomed to the alarm signals. Shallow trenches or simple shelters in backyards offered little protection from fire. The city's fire department had about 8,000 firefighters and was mostly equipped with hand pumps and bucket brigades, which were more suited to fighting fires in peacetime than to an air raid that would unleash a firestorm. Unaware of the futility of their efforts against napalm, neighborhood fire brigades, consisting mainly of women, young people, and the elderly, stood ready with water and sand. The Pathfinders landed shortly before midnight on March 10th. To guide the main forces, they circled the city at an altitude of 25,000 feet and dropped their M47 napalm bombs, forming a huge flaming X that stood out against the darkness of the metropolis below. That was the signal. A few minutes later, the main wave launched its relentless attack. Fire began to fall from the sky from an altitude of 5,000 feet. Thousands of M69 bombs rained down on the wooden roofs as the clusters broke apart. Before the impact, witnesses on the ground reported the terrifying sight of metallic objects glinting in the ever-increasing light of the fire. Then the ignition began. Almost simultaneously, thousands of fires exploded in the densely populated neighborhoods as the delayed fuses detonated. Small fires grew into larger ones, then into blazing walls of flame that leapt from house to house, street to street, driven by the strong ground winds that LeMay's meteorologists had predicted. The meticulously staged conflagration began. Unimaginably high temperatures were reached, hot enough to melt glass, set asphalt roads on fire, and cause buildings to collapse from the heat alone, even before the flames reached them. The air itself became a weapon. Debris and, sadly, people were sucked into the air by the powerful updrafts and flaming tornadoes caused by the violent rise of superheated gases. Visibility was almost impossible in the thick, acrid smoke. Screams and the sound of collapsing buildings were drowned out by the roar of the fire. Within seconds, escape routes disappeared. Crowded with frightened people and blocked by flames, the narrow alleys turned into death traps. Imagine the sheer terror of being there. The bombs sounded like heavy rain, according to Yoshiko Hashimoto, a young mother who was at home with her infant while her husband was on duty. When she and her family left the house, chaos reigned in the streets. Debris rained down in flames. Everywhere, the fire was fanned by the wind. Entire sections of houses, doors, and signs flew through the air. When they reached the Sumida River, there was no real place of refuge left. The banks were lined with burning warehouses. They were saved by their father's desperate attempt to push her and her baby into the river. But he, her mother, and her sister perished in the flames. Thousands of such tragic stories were told that night. The water itself was extremely hot for many who sought refuge in canals, or they were crushed in the panicked escape from the heat. Schools and temples designated as evacuation shelters were surrounded by fire, turning seemingly safe places into graveyards. After inspection, Kikukawa Elementary School, where hundreds had sought refuge, was found to be nothing more than charred ruins and melted metal. Suffocating smoke and radiant heat burned the ground above, and even underground shelters offered little protection. The air itself was no longer breathable. Wave after wave, the B-29s bombarded the unfortunate city for about 3 hours with more than 600 tons of incendiary bombs, or over 424,000 individual bomblets. Even miles high in their sealed chambers, the crews flying in the later waves noticed the smell of burning flesh. The enormous heat currents caused turbulence that tossed the huge bombers around like toys. The brightness of the firestorm could be seen from more than 150 miles away. For the people on the ground, it felt like an eternity in hell. On March 10th, as dawn broke, the extent of the destruction became clear. Nearly 16 square miles of smoking wilderness had replaced the once bustling Shidamachi district. More than 267,000 buildings, or 25% of Tokyo's total building area, were destroyed and reduced to ashes and rubble. In dramatic contrast to the smoke-filled sky, only the most sturdy brick or concrete structures remained standing. The death toll from the 2 atomic bombs dropped later that year, paled in comparison to the human losses. It is generally estimated that over 100,000 people lost their lives that one night, with tens of thousands more injured. But the exact figures are disputed. Within a few hours, the lives of more than 1 million people were destroyed, leaving them homeless and searching for their loved ones in the rubble. The U.S. suffered only minor losses. 96 soldiers were killed, while only 14 bombers, a tiny fraction of the attack force, did not return. Some were killed by the turbulence of the inferno, others by sporadic anti-aircraft fire, or the few desperate attacks by Japanese night fighters. Operation Meetinghouse was considered a frightening success by the American command. The plan had worked, perhaps too well, and General Arnold praised LeMay in a telegram for the courage of his crew to risk everything. The operation had an immediate and significant impact on Tokyo and on the outcome of the war. LeMay wasted no time. Similar low-altitude incendiary bombing raids devastated Japan's next three largest cities, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, within 10 days. The only reason for the brief interruption in the campaign was that the bombers had literally run out of incendiary bombs. American factories immediately increased production. No Japanese city was safe, that much was clear. The atomic bombs often overshadow these firebombing raids in Western memory, but they significantly altered the course of the air war in the Pacific. The ability to develop, manufacture, and deploy such advanced weapons on a large scale, and to replace losses almost immediately, was a testament to America's enormous industrial power. Japan was simply unable to compete. Its already battered industry was now being systematically destroyed, not only in large companies, but also in thousands of small local workshops that were destroyed by the firebombing raids. Production never fully recovered from the loss of skilled personnel who were either killed or displaced. Consider the stark difference. The cost of the B-29 program alone was about $3 billion, comparable to Japan's annual military spending in the final years of the war. America produced tens of thousands of tons of incendiary bombs every month, while Japan struggled for fuel and basic ammunition. This was a gap in economic and technological power, not just a discrepancy in numbers. America took a systematic, almost scientific approach, testing the effectiveness of bombs on replica Japanese cities in the Utah desert, perfecting napalm formulas in university laboratories, and using sophisticated meteorology to determine the ideal night for maximum destruction. Japan's defense relied more on outdated techniques and sheer willpower due to rivalries between the armed forces, poor communication, lack of radar, and dwindling resources. Tragically, this was not enough to withstand the attack. This had a tremendous psychological impact on the Japanese population. Contrasting with the nightly reality of fire raining from the sky, the government's propaganda about certain victory rang hollow. Fear and a growing sense of helplessness replaced complacency. Official accounts were undermined by first-hand reports spread by refugees fleeing the burning cities. As people prioritized survival or simply lost the will to continue supporting a seemingly hopeless cause, absenteeism in the workplace skyrocketed. Routine air raids became a grim reality. Did the firebombing shorten the war? LeMay was undoubtedly convinced that his campaign could force surrender without resorting to a costly ground invasion. In the fall of 1945, military strategists predicted that Japan would be completely destroyed by conventional bombing, especially firebombing. It is undeniable that the ongoing destruction of Japanese cities contributed significantly to the final decision to surrender. Even though historians continued to debate the exact relative importance of the bombing campaign compared to the Soviet Union's entry into the war or the atomic bombs themselves. Emperor Hirohito himself mentioned the suffering and destruction of his people. It is a terrible irony that the appalling death toll in Tokyo and elsewhere may have prevented the even more horrific carnage that would have been expected from the Allied invasion of the home islands, Operation Downfall, which would have killed millions on both sides. That is a difficult reality to accept. Curtis LeMay, who famously said that he expected to be tried as a war criminal if he lost the war, acknowledged that his orders were harsh. Apparently, victory in a complete battle provided its own defense. However, the memories remained with the American air crews who flew these missions. Even decades later, many people were forever changed because they had seen the immense conflagration below them and recognized the human cost. Ordinary people are called upon in times of war to perform remarkable and sometimes horrific tasks in the name of strategy and duty. The firebombing of Tokyo is a sobering reminder of the devastation that can be wrought by modern conflict, in which civilian populations are cruelly drawn into strategic considerations. It draws attention to the terrible effectiveness of industrial warfare and the dreadful power that arises when technology is used solely for destructive purposes. The firestorm that engulfed Tokyo on March 10, 1945, may still be the most catastrophic air raid in human history, even if the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki have become symbols of the end of the war. Born of strategic necessity and the terrible logic of total war, it was a night of indescribable suffering. Understanding this event means more than just remembering the past. It also means understanding the forces that have shaped our world and comprehending the high human cost of war. Moments like these are often covered. The easiest way to stay up to date is to subscribe if you want to make sure you don't miss any future investigations into significant historical events. By learning about events such as the firebombing of Tokyo, we can better understand World War II, the complex legacy of the Luftwaffe, and the difficult moral dilemmas that arise in times of conflict. We appreciate you taking the time to learn about this story. You can find more videos about significant events during World War II here on our channel.